Good morning, everyone. Hope you're well. Welcome to the second last class of CS 206. On Monday, you finished up deliverable 3, and hopefully you're working now on your final project. All details are found in this document here. We went through them last time. If you haven't already, please make sure to scroll down to after the deliverables. There are a lot of details about the written report and oral presentation, both of which are due not this Sunday, but the following Sunday by 11:59 p.m. And then on Monday, May 17th, we will all meet here for the oral presentations. Any questions about the final project, written reports, oral videos, oral presentations? Going once, going twice. Okay. All right, so we are going to start in on our second last lecture. This is the first lecture in the final theme, where we're going to look at broadening our evolutionary algorithm so that it is now able to optimize not just the weights of the synapses in the robot's neural network controller, so evolving not just the brain of the robot, but evolving aspects of the robot's body as well. Some of you may already be tackling this in your final project. We're going to talk today about the very first attempt to do this by Carl Sims back in the early 90s. Okay, this was arguably the most famous and still successful project in all of evolutionary robotics. It dates back to the very beginnings of evolutionary robotics in the early 1990s. I'll play a video of some of these evolved virtual robots in a moment. I mentioned throughout the course that physics engines weren't available until 2000. Carl Sims was a computer graphics researcher, and back in the early 1990s, he sat down and wrote his own physics engine. Once he had that physics engine, he wrapped an evolutionary algorithm around it. Evolutionary algorithms have been around since arguably the 1950s, so that was a well-known algorithm. And then he ran his physics engine and evolutionary algorithm on, I'll come back and play the video in a moment, ran it on the Connection Machine 5, which in the early 1990s was state-of-the-art supercomputing. You can actually, if you go back and watch Jurassic Park, you'll actually see the CM5 has a cameo appearance. It's got this hallmark flashing red lights. What did these red lights represent? They represented, if the light was on or off, whether or not one of the 1,024 cores that made up the connection machine was at work. So this was a very early, massively parallel supercomputer. Why was it called the Connection Machine 5? The reason was that each of these 1,024 cores was connected to 5 of its neighbors. So conceptually, all of these cores existed in a 5-dimensional space where they had 5 neighbors, actually 6-dimensional space, and they were able to communicate back and forth with each other. You know from your parallel hill climber that evolutionary algorithms are useful because you can make them parallel. You can be evaluating multiple solutions, multiple virtual worlds in parallel. That is more or less what Carl Sims did on the Connection 5 machine. Back in 94, it had a peak of 131 gigaflops, or billion floating point operations per second. The Mac Pro from 2 years ago had an RPeak of slightly less than that. So despite the fact that it sort of filled up half a room, it was a pretty big machine, it was very powerful even by today's standards. So in the early 1990s, the company that produced the Connection 5 machine, known as Thinking Machines, the Thinking Machines Corporation. You can go and read up on this if you're interested in the history of computing. They hired Carl to write a computer program that would show off and simultaneously flex the muscles of the CM5. And Carl Sims came up with this idea of evolving virtual creatures in a simulated world. So depending on how you count, this is sort of the beginning of evolutionary robotics. I'm going to play the video. It's about 5 minutes long, so you get a sense of what Carl was able to achieve, and then we'll dive into the technical details of exactly how he did it.
This demonstration shows virtual creatures that were evolved to perform specific tasks in simulated physical environments. Swimming speed was used to determine survival. Most of the creatures are results from independent evolutions. Some developed strategies similar to those in real life. Once they're evolved, multiple copies of these creatures can be made and simulated together in the same environment. The next group of creatures were evolved for their ability to move on a simulated land environment with gravity and friction. Some simple solutions with just 2 parts were found. Some seemed like they could use some assistance, while others were fairly efficient, such as this rowing-like behavior. Here is an odd cousin of the previous. A mutation caused him to tumble. Some creatures evolved to incorporate contact sensors in their control systems. Here is another inchworm-like creature that tends to go in circles. This was actually a creature first evolved for its ability to swim in water, then later put on land and evolved further. A successful sidewinding ability resulted. Here is one with a hopping style. The protrusions on its arms seemed to help prevent it from tipping over. This was the fastest, with a successful galloping-like stride. This group was evolved for their jumping ability. This group was evolved for their ability to adaptively follow a red light source. The resulting creatures are now being interacted with. A user is moving the light source around as the creature behaves. This one seems to flail randomly, but somehow still manages to approach the light. Perhaps it is mean to move the goal away just as it arrives. Here is one that has propeller-like fins which are tilted depending on the direction of the light. It can adaptively swim up or down very well. This final group of creatures was evolved for their ability to compete for control of a green cube. The creature closest to the cube at the end of a simulation is the winner. Here, a strategy first arose for simply tumbling towards the cube. Then one learned to block out his opponent. But then later one learned to overcome the obstacle by climbing over it. Some pinned down their opponents. Some covered the cube with protective arms. Others simply unfolded onto the cube. The success of a strategy is often highly dependent on the opponent. Here is a hockey-playing creature, which takes the cube away and wins by a large margin. Here are 2 similar hockey strategies battling it out, with appropriate gestures. This crab-like creature walks well, but often continues past the cube and instead seems to prefer beating up on his opponent. Against the arm, the crab seems to simply walk away. A successful strategy is this 2-arm technique that swipes quickly in from the side and moves the cube over to a second arm. These are the final rounds of competition amongst the overall best. Finally, the seeker arm goes against the side swiper, but the cube is just out of reach.
Pretty impressive when you think that this work was carried out 27 years ago, probably older than many of you here on the call today. Quite impressive. One of the examples from the history of science of reaching a high watermark and it taking many, many years until other researchers are able to replicate and surpass this work. So very impressive. And as you can see from the video, the evolutionary algorithm is clearly making adaptive changes to both the body and neural controller of the robots. Okay, sorry, a detail I forgot to mention on the Connection 5 machine, Sims was evolving his creatures. He used an initial random population of 300 creatures and evolved those 300 creatures for 100 generations. Some of you may not be able to achieve that at the moment on your laptops, but on the Connection 5 machine, this actually didn't take too long, about 3 hours. Okay, so in many ways, both hardware and software, this was work that was in many ways ahead of its time. Okay, let's unpack Sims's project here, how he actually accomplished this. As we've seen many times before now, we're going to look at the genotype on the left here, the blueprint or the way that solutions are encoded. And then we're going to look at the phenotypes, which, like your project, are virtual robots. Okay. The genotypes, as we've talked about before, in an evolutionary algorithm can be encoded in lots of different data structures. You can use a vector or a matrix, which most of you are using. We've looked at genetic programming, which encodes genotypes as trees. Today, we're going to look at genotypes which are encoded as nested directed multigraphs, and I'll unpack the adjectives here as we go. For now, the operative word here is a graph. So you can see that the DNA or the genetic encoding of each robot is encoded as a graph. A graph contains a series of nodes, and those nodes are connected by edges. If those edges are directed, meaning they point from one node to the other, we have a directed graph. In most graphs, there is at most one edge that can travel from one node to another. If it's possible to have multiple edges connecting one node with another, that's known as a multigraph. You might not have seen that before. It's just kind of a rare variant on graphs. I'll talk about the nested part in a little bit. Okay, and again, the phenotypes are these robots. So why encode our virtual robots in a directed multigraph? The reason why Sims chose to do this is because he noticed, as many people have, is that organisms are not random collections of body parts. If you look at the physiology or the anatomy of plants and animals, they contain a lot of repetition and symmetry. If you need to get around on land or in the ocean, I guess, it makes sense to be bilaterally symmetric. It makes sense for the left side of your body to look like your right side of the body, because most of the time you'd like to move forward in a straight line. It's extremely difficult to coordinate actions of your body if you are bilaterally asymmetric to move forward. Repetition is also important. Once you find a good component, like a pair of legs, duplicating that component and adding pairs of legs can improve your behavior. Same thing goes for branching structures that we find in the plant kingdom. So today we're going to look at not just the genotype and the phenotype, but we're going to look at what's known as the genotype to phenotype mapping, which is represented by the thick arrows here. It's the algorithm or the procedure that translates the genotype into the phenotype. Most of the time, this genotype to phenotype mapping is trivial. So in your own code, you have a vector or a matrix of numbers which encode the synaptic weights. That's your genotype. And the mapping is trivial. You take elements out of that matrix and you embed them in the NNDF file. You basically label the links or the synapses in the neural network controller. There's not much to that process. As you're going to see in Sims's work today, this mapping is much more sophisticated. Why build in this additional complexity? The reason is that this mapping, coupled with this genotype, tends to produce, even for randomly created genotypes, it produces non-random phenotypes. Not random collections of body parts, but virtual creatures that tend to have various types of symmetries, repetitions, and variations on a theme. We saw this actually before when we looked at the HyperNeat algorithm a few weeks back, which was a more modern evolutionary algorithm also designed to bias the evolutionary algorithm towards symmetric and repetitive body plans. So far, so good? Any questions? Okay. Okay, so let's have a look at how this actually works. Let's have a look at, first of all, the genotype. Let's dive into this a little bit in more detail. Let's imagine we're going to create a random genotype. Like genetic programming, imagine we have a bag with nodes and edges in it. We reach into the bag and we pull out a node. We can create an arbitrary number of outgoing edges. So we reach into the bag a random number of times and pull out a bunch of outgoing edges. We pull out another node, snap that onto the head of one of the open arrows, and we repeat this process. We basically construct a random graph made up of nodes and edges, and we make sure that every edge, the base of every edge has a node, and the head of every edge has a node. We've already spent a fair bit of time talking about graphs, but usually in our discussions we've been treating them as neural networks, where the nodes are neurons and the arrows are synapses. In this case, this is not a neural network. It's a network or a graph that's encoding both the body and the brain, as we'll see in a moment, of these virtual creatures. Okay, once we have our nodes and edges, there are a number of parameters or labels associated with each node, and there are a number of labels or parameters associated with each edge as well. So as we're constructing this random graph, we visit each node in turn, and for each of these node labels, we pull out a random, we assign a random number. 3 of the parameters describe the length, width, and height of the block that's encoded by that node. So you'll notice that each node is incorporating information about a given body part. Inside the node, there is also information about the joint that connects that body part back to its parent body part. I should have put up my whiteboard today. My apologies. I didn't, so I'm going to have to act this out. As you probably figured out already, in your body.urdf file, the bodies are encoded as trees, where we have the base as the root of the body. And then every other body part making up your robot has information about that body part and also information about the joint that connects that body part back to its parent body part. The body part is an upper leg, like in the quadruped. The parent body part is the base. If the body part is the lower leg, the parent node is the upper leg, right? Information that's flowing up towards the root of the virtual creature. Okay, so inside each node, there's information about how to build a body part and how to connect that body part to its parent, where the parent, I'll take this example down here, when we're constructing this body part, the leg segment, there's information that connects it back to its root node, which is its parent node, which is the one behind it, if we go back up the arrow. So for example, here's another example. Here we have a body, and there's information in here about the length, width, and height of the body. As we travel along this edge, there's information in here about the length, width, and height of the head. There is also information in here about the joint that connects the head to the body. Okay. That information can be what kind of joint it is. It's either a hinge joint, like you're using in your final project, or a ball and socket joint, which is like your shoulder. Various types of joints. The joint limit, so how much what's the range of rotation for that joint, and a final parameter here called recursive limit, which I'll describe in a moment. Okay, so as we start to translate or map the genotype into the phenotype, we start at the root node. So one of these nodes in each of these graphs is tagged as the root node, or in PyBullet, this would be the base. We take all the information in there and construct the base body part. Because it's a base body part, by definition, it has no parent body part. So whatever joint information is encoded in this base part, we just ignore those numbers and we finish building this body part. We then travel along each edge in turn, and as we move from the root node along, for example, the first edge, that edge also has a series of parameters associated with it. And as you can see, these parameters are deltas. So as we move along the edge, we take with us information about the body part we just built. So as we go from here along this edge, we take information about the length, width, and height of this root branch. We take not only the length, width, and height, but we also take XYZ. That's scale here, length, width, and height. We also take information about XYZ. Where was the body part placed? And we also take a 7th, 8th, and 9th number, which is the yaw, pitch, and roll. These are the three numbers that dictate how this object is oriented in three-dimensional space. As we move out along this edge, there are these 9 numbers corresponding to XYZ, yaw, pitch, and roll, and length, width, and height. We apply those numbers, or we take these 9 numbers and we multiply them by these 9 numbers, which alters those 9 numbers, so that when we arrive back at a new part, we have a new position, we have a new orientation, and we have a new length, width, and height. And when we arrive at a new node, so if we've traveled from here to here, or if we follow a self node like you see here, and we arrive back at the node we just left, whatever information is inside this new node, the XYZ, yaw, pitch, and roll, and length, width, and height in here, we use those deltas to alter those numbers. Right, so they help, for example, actually, let's stick with the tree example here. So if we've placed this tree here and we travel along this edge, that edge alters X, Y, and Z in this way, takes us to this new X, Y, and Z where we're going to place this piece. It's changed the orientation of this branch. So this branch has a different yaw, pitch, and roll, a different orientation from this one. And we might have altered the length, width, and height. So you see as we start to travel out along these branches, the branches are getting shorter. Length is becoming less and less. Yeah? Okay. So these are altering the relative position, orientation, and scale of the object we're about to build. There is a fourth label here, which is reflection, and this number can reflect X, Y, and Z, and orientation. It can flip the part along around the x-axis, y-axis, or z-axis. Okay. All right, so let's go back to this example here. So we've built the base branch. We've followed this edge back to this node again, and we've now taken the information in here and modified it by the deltas in here to build this branch. Let's pause for a moment, go back to this branch. We just followed this edge, so we also need to follow this edge, which has different numbers associated with it, different deltas, which means when we arrive back here and try and build another one of these, we build another one of these, but we build it at a different XYZ with a different orientation and possibly a different scale. Make sense? Okay. We continue in this process, so you can see in this branching recursive manner, and this is where the recursive mapping comes in. As we recursively follow all of these edges, we keep building branches upon branches upon branches. And this could obviously go on ad infinitum. There's no way to stop this recursive process at the moment, except for the recursive limit here. So every time we visit a node, there is an integer associated with it, and that integer was set randomly when we first built the graph. Every time we visit a segment, we decrease the integer stored in that node by 1. As long as that value when we arrive at a node is greater than 0, we follow all the outgoing edges. But if we visited this node a sufficient number of times that we've decreased the recursive limit to 0, we no longer follow all of its outgoing edges. Okay, in this example here, the recursive limit was set to 5. What would happen if a mutation hit this genotype and changed the recursive limit inside this node from 5 to 6? What would be the impact on the phenotype? What would this tree look like if the recursive limit was mutated from 5 to 6? If you have an idea, go ahead and type it into chat, or feel free to unmute yourself. Any ideas? So you'll notice as we travel out from the base, if the recursive limit is 5, 4, 3, actually, sorry, we should count from, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Logan said there would be another set of branches off each of the fifth elements, right? The current tips, exactly. So we would grow another pair off the very edge of each of these twigs. I forgot to mention another detail. Obviously, there are more than 5 branches here. This recursive limit is actually reset to its original value if you have multiple edges arriving. It gets a little complicated, but I think you get the basic idea. Decreasing or increasing recursive limit will grow more or less stuff. Okay, let's imagine another mutation. Let's go back to the original here. Let's say we have this genotype that produces this phenotype. Let's imagine a mutation here adds a third edge, another edge that leaves this segment, curves around and comes back and attaches to this segment again. What would be the phenotypic impact of that mutation, adding a third edge? What would this tree now look like? Any ideas? Feel free to type into chat or unmute yourself. As Logan mentions, of course, instead of having 2 branches coming off every base branch, we'd have branches of 3 at every recursive level here. Okay, I think you get the idea. Let's have a look now at some of the evolved creatures. Here's 12 of them. Just to build up an intuition for how this works, I want you to get out a piece of pen and get out some pen and paper, or do this draw on your laptop if that's more comfortable. Here's 12 different phenotypes. I want you to try and draw a genotype. Draw out a graph like these ones here that is likely to produce one of these phenotypes. Like the graphs here, don't bother going into the details of actually writing down numbers associated with each node and edge. Just figure out how many different nodes you might need for some of these phenotypes, and then what are the arrows or what are the connectors between them. I'll give you a minute or two to work on that. Here, again, for your reference, is just actually the node and edge labels to show how they influence the phenotype. Some of these are obviously easier than others. Obviously, if we were all together in the classroom, I'd ask you to come up to the front on the whiteboard and actually draw some of the genotypes for these phenotypes. Hunter asks to see the examples again. Sure, no problem. I'd ask you to draw them. We're not going to be able to do that this morning. So I'll give you another 30 seconds or so, and then if anyone wants to try and verbally describe what their graph looks like, that would be great. Okay, anybody want to give it a go? Logan has his hand up. Logan, you want to give it a try?
So I went for number 3, and what I did was I had one kind of body node, and then I had 2 edge nodes coming off of that pointing to an arm node, and then the arm node is recursively pointing at itself.
Great. Yeah, that's the idea, right? So if you eyeball number 3 here, you'll notice there's just 2 unique pieces. There's the body piece, and then I don't know what this is. Is this a wing or a fin? So this genotype is probably made up of just 2 nodes. Actually, not that different from this one here. 2 different nodes, one for the body and one for the leg segments. And as Logan was mentioning, 2 edges coming off it from the body to the leg, corresponding to the left and the right side. And then iterating through that with a recursive limit of 3 to a self edge that recreates a leg segment on a leg segment on a leg segment, and then a leg segment on a leg segment. Actually, now that I mention it, let's come back to the hexapod here, the insect example or spider example here. Once we build a leg segment, again, a single self connection will keep adding a single piece onto the tip of the base piece, like in the tree here, where 2 twigs were added to each individual branch. Lucas says number 6 looks, Hunter says looks like number 6, exactly. So same thing here, right? The genotype for this phenotype also probably has just 2 nodes, one for body segment and one for fin. Some of these, like this one, you could imagine that the genotype for this is even just a single node. Create this piece, one self connection that goes from this piece to produce this one, the self connection again, and on we go. All right, Lucas has dropped a picture in here that seems to make sense. Yep. This one, maybe 3 unique pieces: the body, fin segment, and dorsal fin. This looks quite different from these 2 other pieces. My guess would be that the genotype for this has 3 different nodes comprising it. Okay. One last detail here that I've highlighted, which is the terminal only flag. So associated with each edge is also a binary value. That binary value means follow that edge. Let's assume that this one has this terminal only set to 1. It says only follow this edge when the recursive limit of this node, its parent node, gets to 0. Why include this detail? What is this for? Where might this be useful? Any ideas? Let's think about this one here. So this one is probably following a self edge with a large positive recursive limit, or whatever this is, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And when the recursive limit gets to 0, imagine there is an outgoing edge from the node that produces this body part, where the terminal only is set to 1. Only then will you follow that part, and as Lucas says, to produce some interesting body part like a hand at the end of a long arm, right? So if you look at a lot of organisms like us, there are unique features that are found at the distal tip, or at the end of a sequence of body parts. So in anatomy, we talk about distal and proximal. So proximal in this case means closer in towards the center of the body, and proximal means out towards the tip, right? So we have a hand at the proximal end of our arm, and we have fingers at the distal edges of our hand, and so on. Yeah. Okay, so all of these details are built in, where evolution can obviously play with these parameters and produce diverse forms. But these forms, as you can see, are not random collections of parts. Okay, so far we've only talked about the genotype and how it produces the body. You see now why this is a multigraph and why it's directed. We haven't talked about the nested aspect of the genotype yet. The nested part allows this genotype to also encode the neural controller for this robot. So let's take this phenotype over here. This phenotype has two nodes, this part which constructs a body segment, and this node which defines the fins. Nested inside of each node is another graph. So a nested graph, as the name implies, if you zoom into each node of a graph, you find another graph inside. What do you think the nodes and edges, before I describe what the nodes and edges are inside the nested graph, what do you think these nodes and edges are encoding? What do the nested nodes correspond to, and what do the nested edges correspond to? Any ideas? These nested nodes, not orientation, these nested nodes and nested edges are going to correspond to neurons and synapses. The way to read this is this body part, this node, which constructs this piece and this piece. Every time this node is visited, it deposits these three neurons inside here. When this node is visited, when we follow this edge and this node is visited again, it's going to construct this piece. And when it does, it's again going to drop three neurons in here. So we've got three neurons in here, three neurons in here, and every time we construct one of the four fins, we're going to drop 6 neurons in each of the four fins. And the edges here show edges that are inside the same node here. These are local connections, local synapses. So inside this fin, there is this neuron, and they are connected by this synapse. In this fin, this fin, this fin, and this fin. You'll notice there is this special node here shown dashed. The dashed line is meant to represent that this part of the neural network corresponds to no one part of the body. So this is the brain of the robot, or the central nervous system. This is the central nervous system, and these neurons and synapses are known as the peripheral nervous system. So in us, the central nervous system is up here, and the peripheral nervous system is the spine and all the other neurons and synapses spread throughout our body. So evolution can tinker with and alter with some centralized control for the robot and also localized control. Logan asks, are local connections, are local synapses different than a hidden layer? That's a good question. So synapses in the hidden layer, remember the hidden layer is meant to be hidden from the world, meaning those neurons and synapses have no direct contact with either the sensor layer and the sensors out in the physical world. They also have no direct connection with the motors and the actions that are being applied to the outside world. So it depends on what these neurons are, Logan. These could be, the neurons in here could be sensor neurons, motor neurons, or sensor neurons, hidden neurons, or motor neurons. Let's talk about what these neurons actually are now. As I just mentioned, these neurons and synapses become the non-local brain. They're not really specific to any one body part. Inside these robots, there are a series of sensors that are available to them. There are joint sensors, or the proprioceptive sensors, which we've talked about before. These are sensors that record the angle of the joint that they're associated with. You'll notice that the fin has two joint sensor neurons associated with it, or two joint sensors. These fins, although it's not specified here, are actually connected to the body with two different hinge joints, which allow them to do this and to do this. And taken together, those two hinge neurons allow the fin to do what fins often do, which is a figure 8 stroke. Okay, so at each point in time, each fin has two of these joint sensors. So the robot knows what the two angles are that describe the fin relative to the main body. The value from these sensor neurons are flowing into, among other things, are flowing into these neurons here, which, Logan, are hidden neurons. We'll talk about these symbols in a moment. Values from the hidden neurons are flowing out to E0 and E1, which are effector neurons. So Sims called these effector neurons. These are equivalent to the motor neurons that we're working with. Effectors and motors are more or less synonymous terms in robotics. Okay, we have two motor neurons associated, embedded in each of the four fins. Because again, there are two hinge joints. We need to apply forces to those two hinge joints to get the fin to sweep through its pattern. Okay. There are also contact or touch sensors that are possible, and photosensors. You noticed in the video that some of the robots were evolved to perform phototaxis, which means go towards the light. You might remember that from our discussion about Bratenberg vehicles. Okay, so sensor neurons, motor neurons, and then we got a whole bunch of these hidden neurons. And you'll notice that all of these hidden neurons have different symbols inside of them. And these are some of these symbols. What aspect of neural networks are these symbols representing? Remember our discussion about neural networks? We talked about all the building blocks of neural networks. What do these symbols represent? What part of the neural network are they defining? In a neural network, you'll find neurons, synapses, synaptic weights. What are we missing? Remember how we update a neural network. We visit a neuron. We find all of the incoming synapses to that neuron. We take the value of the presynaptic neuron, which sits at the base of an incoming synapse. We take the value of that presynaptic neuron, multiply it by the weight of that synapse. go to the next incoming synapse, multiply the weight of its presynaptic neuron with its synaptic weight, and we compute this weighted sum. The sum of all the values of the presynaptic neurons weighted by the synaptic weights that connect them to this neuron. Once we have that weighted sum, what do we do with it? We pass it through the activation function. We have that raw sum, and before we send that value out along that neuron's outgoing edges or outgoing synapses, we pass it through a function. As we saw when we talked about neural network, we can have all different kinds of functions. In this particular project, Sims used a large number of activation functions. Here's the sigmoid down here. This is the most common one in neural networks today. But as you can see, back in the early 1990s, there were all sorts of different kinds of functions that could be applied. We won't go through all of them. We won't go through all of them, but some of them might look a little familiar to you. You'll notice that some of the neurons here, or two of the activation functions, output a wave function, a sinusoidal pattern, or a saw function. It's also an oscillating signal, but it has this sawtooth pattern. What does that remind you of? A neuron that's outputting a wave function or a saw function? Where have we seen that before? Did we see it in NEAT? Possibly. What do we call Hannah says they're the neurons that tell you to do something over and over again. Exactly, right? They're neurons that are outputting a constantly varying or constantly oscillating value. What are those neurons called? You have them distributed all throughout your spine. And if you cut off the head of a chicken and the headless chicken will continue running, it's because these particular neurons are sending oscillatory signals to the chicken's legs. Anybody remember? Starts with a C. No? These are central pattern generators, or CPGs. Lucas got it. Okay, exactly. Central pattern generators. So a lot of familiar, we saw it in the bipedal lecture. That's right, exactly. So lots of different kinds of, it looks unfamiliar, but actually these are things we've seen before. Sensor neurons, motor neurons, hidden neurons, and these neurons in here, evolution can alter the kinds of activation functions that are associated with them. If you want to know the details of some of these, which we haven't talked about, please go ahead and have a look at the paper. There's lots of great details in there. Okay. So, So here's the genotype, and here is a partly unrolled genotype. So this is after the genotype to phenotype mapping. You'll notice we can kind of see you can see the four fins down here. Here's fin number one. Here's fin number one, fin number two, fin number three, and fin number four. Each one has two joint sensors associated with it. And the labeling isn't very good here, but here's the two motor neurons in fin 1, fin 2, fin 3, and fin 4. You can then see here's a set of neurons here that's repeated again here. These are the neurons in the two groupings of neurons in the two, sorry, I'm jumping around a bit, in the two body segments. 1, 2. And then up here, there is there's a triplet of neurons that only exist once. This is the central brain of this robot. Saw, wave, and interpolate up here, 3 neurons. Okay. Interestingly, you'll notice one of the neurons in the brain is the wave function. So this is outputting a constantly oscillating value. This is a central pattern generator. There is another central pattern generator here, another wave neuron in each of the fins. Again, this is actually quite close to us, where in your spinal cord, you have a series of central pattern generators throughout the spinal cord. Okay, that's a lot of information. Any questions about the genotype, phenotype, or genotype to phenotype mapping before we move on? All good? Okay. All right, so that's the genotype. So the evolutionary algorithm, as usual, starts with a population of randomly generated solutions. In this case, each solution in the population is a nested directed multigraph. Each genotype produces a phenotype of virtual robot. We evaluate each virtual robot in Sims's homemade physics engine and get a single fitness value back, exactly like you're doing in your code. So no different. This 27-year-old experiment, not that different in many of the details from what you're doing. We delete the genotypes that correspond to slower moving robots, and we make randomly modified copies of the survivors. In some cases, we can mutate the genotype, but Sims also built in a sexual recombination, where he takes two parent genotypes. Remember, these are graphs. And he needs to find a way to cut these graphs in half and glue the two halves of the graphs together to make new graphs, new multigraphs that become the genotype for the child robot, which inherits genetic material from both parents. You'll remember, Logan already mentioned our lecture on the NEAT algorithm. The NEAT algorithm was designed to solve a remaining open problem in the field, which is that if you take two genotypes, you cut them randomly at half and glue them together, it's extremely unlikely that that child network will work at all, right? If we cut my Mac in half and we cut your PC in half, no matter how we cut those two laptops in half, gluing them together, they're unlikely to work. That's known as the competing conventions problem. You can go back and refresh your memory on that if you like. However, Sims didn't know that at the time, or I presume that he didn't know that at the time. But anyways, he gave it a go by taking the two graphs, and he came up with a way to do this, which is to linearize them. You can see that he arranged the nodes on a one-dimensional line. Did that for parent 1 and parent 2. And then he randomly placed, the crossover operation would randomly place x's at certain points along these two lines. Once these x's have been placed, we can create a child by starting with one of the parents. Let's start with parent 1. We visit the first node. We copy that node into the child. If there are any outgoing edges from parent 1, we copy those outgoing edges into the child. And we keep marching from left to right, copying nodes and outgoing edges into the child until we reach a crossover point. We follow the x down to parent 2, and now we continue marching from left to right, copying nodes and outgoing edges from parent 2 into the child. If we reach another crossover point, we follow that x again, keep copying nodes and edges, and so on. Okay, not that different from how sexual recombination works in nature. Sims was very prolific in this work. He sort of put everything but the kitchen sink into this algorithm. He also included grafting, where you graft genetic material from one individual onto another. In grafting, again, we choose two parents at random in the population. We start copying parent 1. We copy nodes and outgoing edges as we march from left to right. In this case, we place a random outgoing edge. Instead of x's, we connect one node in parent 1 with a random node in parent 2. And when we reach that added edge, we follow that edge, copy that edge into the child, and then continue marching from left to right and copying nodes and edges from parent 2 into the child. Two different ways of combining genetic material from two parents into a child multigraph. Okay. Okay. As usual, that covers genotype, phenotype, genotype to phenotype mapping, mutation, and crossover. What about fitness? How do we actually reward or punish virtual creatures in this experiment? We saw a lot of familiar things like locomotion and jumping, which you should probably be able to write down a fitness function now, no problem. What happens if we take, instead of evaluating the fitness of a single individual in the population, what happens if we pick two individuals at random in the population and we're going to assign a fitness, and we're going to assign a value to both of them depending on how they do relative to one another. We're going to compete them against one another. The better that one virtual creature does, the better its fitness, the worse the fitness of the competitor, and vice versa. You saw that towards the end of the video where Sims created a fitness function and a virtual environment that rewards for competition, which in this case is competing over a limited resource. This is clearly an important problem that most species have to solve in some way. So we place a virtual creature at one position, another virtual creature at another position. We place the cube in the center, and the one that captures the cube gets higher fitness. You'll notice this dotted line here, which means all of the creatures have to be, when they're placed, they have to be behind this line, and they can be no taller than this arrow. How come? So they're placed in a zone, actually, that they're placed under an overhang or a virtual overhang. They can't be any taller than this dashed line. Why? Any ideas? As Logan mentions, because perverse instantiation rears its head here, one of the best ways to capture the cube is to evolve a very tall creature, not even bother with neural control, and just allow the tall creature to fall onto the cube. I'm pretty sure that's what Sims saw in version 1.0 of his algorithm, so he added in this overhang to discourage tall creatures. Okay. What would be a good fitness function for this? Let's focus on creature number one over here. We compete creature one with creature two. At the end of the simulation, we need to assign a fitness value to creature one. What might that fitness function look like? If you have an idea, you can go ahead and try and type the fitness function directly into chat. In Sims's simulation here, he could access the positions and orientations of each of the body parts making up creature one and creature two, and the XYZ position of the cube. What would be a good fitness function for creature one? Here's one idea. We could create a fitness function that rewards for minimizing the distance between creature one and the cube. So reward it for getting closer. Actually, let me rewrite this for a second. Let me make this a little clearer. Could just write it like this. The fitness is proportional to the distance, but that would actually maximize the distance between C1 and the cube. So how about this? Best value you could get here would be an f equals 0. There is 0 distance between C1 and the cube. There's a problem with this fitness function, though. It's overly simplistic. What are we missing? C1 is competing with C2 and vice versa. How should we assign fitness to creature 1? If the creature is competing, C1 is if C1 is competing with C2, as Logan says, F equals D1 divided by D2 might make sense. Where D1 is the distance of creature 1 and D2 is the distance of creature 2, right? I think maybe we need a negative sign in there, but that's the basic idea. So the fitness for creature 1 is, in this case here, a D2 minus D1. We want to try and maximize D2, or creature 1 wants to maximize the distance between creature 2 and the cube, and creature 1 wants to minimize the distance between itself and the cube. Same thing for F2. Right? So this is the first time we've seen a fitness function that incorporates not just the behavior of the creature to which we're trying to assign fitness, but it also includes terms that describe the behavior of other creatures in the population relative to the current creature we're trying to compute fitness for. If you think about this fitness function, if you remember, you go back and watch the video, you'll notice that some of the creatures came in contact with the cube and they maybe put their hand over the cube so that the other creature couldn't get its hand near the cube. So minimizing D1, put your hand on the cube and your hand blocks creature 2 from touching the block. You'll notice there were some other solutions where one creature would actively push another creature away from the cube. So in that case, evolution tended to focus on this term, trying to maximize the distance of your competitor from the cube and forget about touching the cube yourself. Okay, lots of different ways to solve this problem. Okay, so that's our fitness function. Now, the last remaining thing we need to figure out is how to actually evaluate all of the individuals in the population. We have n individuals in the population, and we need to evaluate each of them in a pairwise competition. The simplest thing to do would be to compete all versus all, meaning take for n individuals in the population, take each unique pair of individuals and compete them in a simulated competition. How many competitions would we need to perform if the population size is n? Any ideas? Here's a simpler case. Imagine we have our population of n individuals. We pick 2 individuals at random and we compete them. We then take 2 other individuals in the population that have not competed yet and we compete them against each other. Pick another uncompeted pair, compete them, and so on. How many simulations or how many competitions do we need to run in B? Lucas says n over n plus 1 over 2 here. Close, not quite. Got the right idea. Anyone have an idea for either of these two? Logan says for B it's n over 2, right? And for A it's n times n minus 1 divided by 2. Exactly. Okay. What's the problem with all versus all? This is not actually what Sims ended up using. He ended up using D, which we'll talk about in a moment. What's the problem with A? It's a lot of simulations, right? So that's if we have 100 individuals in the population, that's 100 times 99 divided by 2. That's a large number of simulations, even for the connection machine. B, in the opposite, only requires n divided by 2 simulations, which is great, much more computationally efficient. What's the problem with B? Sims also did not use B. Great advantage here in that it requires relatively few simulations. But if we're trying to assign fitness to all the individuals in here, you lose a lot of possible solutions, or at least possible information. You know how this individual did competing against this individual, but you do not know how this individual did competing against this individual. A lot of information that's lost here. Another possibility, which we can steal from college basketball and March Madness, we could create a bracket where we randomly pair up individuals in the population. We compete them against one another. Whoever wins has to go on into a separate simulation and compete against the winner from this pair up, and so on. How many simulations do we need to perform in this case if we have n individuals? If you look at the bracket in this case, or you look at the collection of edges, it's a binary tree, which we just talked about a few minutes ago. How many edges are there here versus how many nodes? The edges represent competitions or simulations. You can work it out for yourself, but you'll notice that there are always, in a binary tree, there's n minus 1 edges for n leaf nodes. Yeah, okay. C suffers from the same problem as B, which is you might have unbeknownst to you, because you haven't computed fitness yet, unbeknownst to you, this is the best competitor. This virtual robot can do very well against everyone else in the population. This individual beats this individual, and this individual is knocked out. This gets a very low fitness value. Unbeknownst to us, this individual might be the second best individual in the population, but we don't know because it got unlucky in being paired up with the best individual in the population. So we lose a lot of information in B and C. Sims came up with this solution down here, which he called all versus best. So in the first generation, he did all versus all. He computed the actual or exact fitness of every individual in the population. That let him determine that in this cartoon, this individual was the best. At the next generation, he did not do all versus all, but he took everyone else and competed each one against the champion, the best one so far. So this is kind of like king or queen of the hill, knock off the best person because you know who's the best at this point. This is a fairer comparison of these individuals than this is. Okay, this turned out to work pretty well. Sims also tried taking his population of n individuals and breaking it into two separate populations of n over 2 individuals, so sort of 2 species, and then tried again these different ways of competing them. When he evolved 2 competing populations, where individuals from one population was always competed against an individual from another population, he got some interesting patterns. I think we talked about all this here. Oh, and all versus best, as you can see from the cartoon, is just as computationally efficient as the bracket. When he competed species against one another, he got interesting patterns. So here's evolutionary time on the horizontal axis here. The black line corresponds to the average fitness in species 2 on the vertical axis, and the gray line reports the average fitness of the first species. As you can see, whenever the fitness of one species went down, the fitness of the other increased, and vice versa. So you can sort of see the fortunes of these 2 species waxing and waning over time. Here's a separate evolutionary run, and here's a third one. In this case, one population, just by chance, happened to evolve such a good strategy that no individuals, or very, very few individuals from the gray species, were ever able to wrestle the block away from members of the black species. This is a particular type of evolutionary process that is seen throughout nature. What is this form of evolution? Anybody know? Any biology students here? This is known as coevolution, where the fitness of a particular species is not so much on how well it does, but how well it does relative to a competing species. So any predator-prey relationship or host and parasite or human and virus interaction, the better one of the two partners does, the worse the other partner does. Gets more complicated than that. Coevolution is a fascinating subject within evolutionary biology. If you're interested, I would suggest looking into it more, but unfortunately we don't have time to talk more about it today. Okay, that concludes our discussion of Carl Sims and the first attempt to evolve both bodies and brains of robots. Any questions about that?
I have a question about the simulation.
Sure, go for it.
How did he do like water simulation? It seems like a really complex thing for one of the first physics engines.
Yep, great question. So simulating fluid dynamics for either things that swim or things that fly is extremely computationally intensive, and that's a great question, Henry. There are different ways to do this. You can do what's known as a first order approximation. What's the first order approximation? Just means sort of a hack or something that's kind of close to water or air, but not exactly. Simulating water or air perfectly is extremely computationally intensive. In a first order approximation, you can assume that as an object moves through three-dimensional space, and we're going to assume that it's moving through water, you know the direction, you know the acceleration, so therefore you know the direction in which the object is moving. You can compute the surface area of the leading edge of the object, and the greater that surface area, the greater the drag. So in the same way that when an object comes into contact with the ground, a physics engine applies a force pushing that object up so it does not pass through the ground. If you have an object that is moving forward, you can apply a drag force which pushes back against the object, and that drag force is larger if the surface area is greater, and it's also larger if the velocity is greater. You can compute that for all of the objects, and that will dictate how they are resisted by drag. On the other hand, as something is pushing through water, you can take more or less again that front face and compute a different force, which is how much force is being pushed in the opposite direction, the lift or the thrust at the point of the joint. So if this is a fin that is pushing backwards through the water, there is another force that you can add that pushes the joint of the fin forward, the propulsion that's provided to the main body of the fish or whatever it is that's swimming. It's actually not too difficult. Remember when we were talking about physics engines, I was mentioning that you can add, the physics engine itself computes all the forces that are acting on the objects that make up your simulation. As the programmer, you can add arbitrary forces on top of that, and you can compute those forces as functions of positions, sizes, orientations, rotations, torque, surface areas, length, width, and height, and so on. If we had got to this lecture earlier, this would be a great final project idea, which is to do a first order approximation of swimming rather than locomotion. Great question, Henry. Got 1 minute left. Any other questions? No? Okay, I think we'll leave things here for today. You have a quiz due tonight. You're working on your final project. I will see you back here Tuesday morning for our final class. Have a good rest of your day, everyone. Bye-bye.